Welcome to the Two Old Guys Talking podcast. Today's topic is about news media. Here we go.
John, the goals of journalism are supposed to be fairness, balance, and impartiality. I'm talking about journalism, all types of news media, what we generally refer to as the press or the mainstream media. I don't feel that's what we're getting. Where do you get your news from?
I get my news from a huge, enormous filter in my head because it's like a lot of things. When you've got any industry that's unregulated in the sense that there's not a formal educational program that leads up to calling yourself a lawyer, a teacher, a dog trainer, a dog breeder, whatever, and then like a governing body afterwards that ensures that the standards that are taught in those disciplines are maintained. It basically is the Wild West. And so the consumer has to be on high alert at all times. And I think that journalism falls into that category, even though journalism is a program that you can learn at university. Again, I'm not familiar with it, but I would assume they're teaching ethics and all that kind of thing. But that's not required any longer.
I think you're saying that the standards have just become too lax. Once you get your journalism degree, then it depends on where you end up being hired, just how formal ethics are actually applied. And it doesn't seem to be applied with any strength in the mainstream media.
That's another good point, but perhaps a separate point. I don't think that you need a journalism degree now in order to dispense news. And using the word news is very loosely used. I mean,
right.
But I think to your point, that someone can get the most authentic, just ethics hammered into them about journalism and checking sources and all the sorts of things that would make us more relaxed in feeling that the news was reliable, is not just the person doing the reporting, but what vehicles are open to them with regards to employment. How many news organizations are there out there that don't pressure and slant because of editorial bias, because of the owner of that media?
Well, I think that most likely somebody with a journalism degree will end up looking for employment with an outlet that probably has a slant towards their own personal biases. I would
graduate. They did not graduate from a journalism program then, because that's the Bible right there. Is you do not have a slant. You are ethically required to report, not judge. That, like, you're talking about writing editorials. I'm talking about reporting the news.
Right. The problem that I have and that I see is that far too often editorial opinions find their way into the actual presentation of facts.
I'd feel confident making the argument that in the vast majority of cases, the goal is to get that opinion out there. The actual news and reality and the balance is a minor consequence and one that should not interfere with the reporting.
Well, I think part of the problem also is that there's just
sarcasm, by the way, but that's not. I'm not advocating that. I'm saying that's what I believe they're doing.
Right. But really, part of the problem is the competition in the news industry. There's a very strong rush to get a story out before it has been properly vetted. The rush to be the first with the news item.
Yeah.
Ratings.
Yeah, that's certainly another. I don't imagine that if we took an independent body of people who had expertise in a variety of disciplines that would vet this stuff as far as guidelines, that could change. We've talked about this in podcast past with regards to the audience factor. I mean, I can be in my own work as ethically driven as possible, but when there is the potential, because of ignorance in the audience, perhaps, because they don't think critically and they can be influenced using cognitive bias, and I perhaps know how to do that, there seems to be very few people who embrace their ethics. They fall into the trap of using that for themselves. Like, look how many clicks my article got. Is like the whole concept of journalism is not structured or enough. There are not enough consequences for unethical behavior. And as I say, we can make the argument, yes, there are specific educational programs which fewer and fewer people seem to be taking or embracing. Why go through all university when you can just set up a website and become a good marketer for clicks? And the problem is it's like dog breeding. 1 out of 100 breeders actually are ethical in what they do. But the public doesn't understand or know that. But they can be like that because the public does not know. And so it's very easy to generate their incomes without having to do the job, which is breeding good dogs, or in the case of journalism, doing good reporting. Why bother if you can earn your living and become a guru because you get the most clicks?
Right. I think that that's a valid consideration. So there's the two ways of looking at it. You can look at it from the angle of being the actual journalist or whoever claims to be a journalist presenting information, and what would be the particular attraction of a particular audience to that particular journalist. Yep. And it does have a lot to do with critical thinking and cognitive biases, that's for sure. I think that there's, in the mainstream media at least, there's a definite trend towards, number one, the 8-second soundbite, and number two, drama, and number three, there's actually seems to be a celebrity focus. You try to put a particular spin on a situation based on the drama behind it, or based on the almost ad hominem attacks of the person involved.
Do you think that from the opposite end, the people who are receiving this type of quote unquote journalism, like when I'm reading something, listening to something, watching something, my spidey sense goes off with regards to, oh, that seems agenda driven here. That is like, what's the name of that late night host? Seth, he used to be on Saturday Night Live. Like, he's a funny guy, but he is so anti-Donald Trump that when you listen to him, there's legitimate stuff to complain about, but he turns it into, and I know he's a comedian reporting as if he's a news guy, but it's sort of a magnification of what we see in the news, where you go, well, geez, you don't need to take that shot. That's a cheap shot. Here's some legitimate things to go after, like making fun of the guy's appearance and all that kind of stuff. All right, fine. That's perhaps the comedic, but after a while, you just go, well, you know what? You could be funny and not need to do all this crap. Is he trying to be a journalist, or is he trying to be a comedian?
No.
He's a late night host. It's just that with like Jon Stewart, when he was on the Daily Show,
mm-hmm.
He was a comedian. And he was very upfront. He would be critical of anybody. Say, look, you know what? I'm a comedian, and I'm using the news as a vehicle to be a comedian. But there was an ethic in place there that was not, where it leaned a little bit more to being critical of the authentic news. It's not that he didn't stray, but there are, in the real news, it's getting hard to tell. Like, or you go, wait a second. You have an agenda here. I get you don't like this guy, but you're a journalist. I should come away from this and make my own decision whether I like that guy or I don't like that guy, or rather than me coming away and going, you know, I think Paul doesn't like that guy that he was reporting on, and here's why I think it. That's a distinction that we just don't seem to see. And I'm not sure that, I don't know that the average consumer of the news out there thinks critically enough, has that spidey sense in place. They seem to just eat it up and digest it, and not digest it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's it. And so there's actually a couple of things, again, that I see. The problem of the actual people presenting the news and the audience that is digesting the news. The people making the news, because that's not always the person presenting it.
Well, I don't call to be distinct. I don't mean the company they work for, but the person making the politician.
Okay.
So you've got the news, or what should be the news. Then you've got the reporter of the news, and then you've got the consumer of the news. I can't blame the people making the news, the politicians. It's what whether we vote them in the next time or not has to do with the people reporting that news, how authentically they do that, and how critically the people who are consuming that news are thinking when they hear it reported. And that in a sense is where everything went down the toilet here is with the internet, because it's all about clicks now. It's not, we're past the Walter Cronkite days.
Right. So it's those three areas. But with regards to the mainstream media, I would personally like to see a little bit more vetting and less. It seems like there's such a left-wing bias in much of the mainstream media. I'm not talking about blogs now, but I'm talking about left-leaning bias. And
I'm curious here, why you say left? Because to me, it's left and right. It's just bias of one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Name media sources that where you don't come out and say that's definitely left or that's definitely right. Now, what I'm not saying is you'll get the extremists on either side who will accuse the neutral, the actual, if the story is reported and that the rational conclusion might go contrary to their political agenda, they will label them as being, that's a left news source. And then a different article that might, reflect poorly on right-wing conservatives, they'll say, that's a pro. Like what we end up with is people making those accusations. But how many are out there where we could read enough of their articles and go, that's just reporting. That's all that is.
Okay, that's a fair enough comment. I think you're right. If you were to look at one particular sources, the body of their work, you would find some sort of bias in it. Yeah. I think that's fair. Nonetheless, there are some egregious examples of bad journalism in the news media where it seems to me obvious that we're not getting fair journalism. I'm just saying that I have a great deal of trouble making up my mind based on the reporting that I see down there.
And it's the agenda-driven.
It's the political agenda that's being driven.
To go back to my own line of work, we have what they call dog obedience. And there's no such thing. The amateur dog trainers have reframed the definition of terms. You go watch a dog obedience competition, and whoever wins that thing, if they leave the ring and then you cut their leash, you find out, oh, wait a second, that wasn't a dog obedience competition. It was a trick competition. It was a play, was a theatrical performance that occurs after countless rehearsals in the same or very similar environments. Oh, but they call it obedience and they teach it because to companion dog owners, and it has no value whatsoever, not in walking your dog past a squirrel. So that's what I'm talking about here is the amateur journalists. I don't care what the degree is, but if they behave in this manner in the way that you just described, they are so numerous in numbers, they can now call what they do the news. But for the purposes of our conversation, I'm calling the news unbiased reporting. And it's just that is not what I think the general public understands the news to be anymore.
Okay, that's a good example. One of the other things that I find interesting, at least about mainstream news media reporting, is the way that they've broken everything down into segments. And I'm thinking in particular to some of the news radio stations. And if they're in the middle of an interview, they'll actually cut somebody off just to jump to their commercial time. So there's partly it has to be considered how you guide an interview, and partly it has to be just this overwhelming emphasis on getting things said, regardless of whether or not a conclusion has been reached.
Well, not just that, like the pressure to get the commercial in, but really, Paul, you and I pick a topic and we talk at length. They report in seconds about things. Like Joe Rogan has his podcast, which is a long form interview. Articles are typically long form articles, and it's difficult to get people to sit still. In theory, that's what we were told, to read a long article. I had that nationally syndicated newspaper column. Okay, you can have 600 words. I'm supposed to use 600 words to help somebody. Seriously, that's a real struggle. All I can do is hopefully give them a hint and point them in a direction. But given enough time, there's a belief that it has to be in short bites. And so we are getting different avenues now to get our news. Like Joe Rogan may not be a journalist, so to speak, but he does a better job. I mean, you talk to somebody for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, as he does upon occasion. If you're there to witness that conversation, you get a lot more information about the big picture. Whereas when it's in bites, I imagine if you went through some of the podcasts that we did and cherry picked little bits here and there, you could lean your audience into believing many things one way or the other. But if they listen to the entire podcast and listen to enough of them, they're in a better position as to whether they decide to like how much weight to give what you or I have to say about any particular topic. So like, again, that form where it's television, where it is a matter of seconds, like even Twitter, we only give you this many words. YouTube, it can only be this many minutes. Like all of that stuff tends to lead us more into a direction of incomplete pictures, and we shouldn't be forming our opinions on the basis of incomplete information.
I think there's a lot to be said for that. It's the short duration and brevity of, or I should say, depth of discussion. I'll give you a couple of examples here. I subscribe to the Economist magazine, and their articles are usually fairly in-depth, and they have specials that are many pages long that really get into it. And that's why I subscribe to it, because I get in-depth and what I consider to be an unbiased opinion. It's actually what I would call good reporting. I also tend to lean towards BBC radio or BBC in general because I find them to be less biased than I see in North American news media.
With regard to BBC, it's kind of like Canada's CBC. If I'm looking at BBC's world reporting versus their country's reporting, my opinion might differ there. But if it's world reporting, yep, I agree. I feel that I'm getting a more of a balanced viewpoint. CBC, their international reporters, I tend to lean, yep, they seem to have an ethic in place. But I do sometimes sense with CBC, there's a leaning that's more leftist when it certainly comes to local for us, but I mean national reporting, like Canada-based. Like one of the sources that I found oddly, surprisingly decent is Aljazeera. Like they tend to embrace a model that is far less biased. Well, again, it's way better than almost anything else I've seen the U.S. calls news. And I would think that, considering the part of the world it comes in, that there'd be an incredible amount of pressure on them to report on the basis of the political system that exists in that region of the world.
I agree with you. I've spent some time reviewing Aljazeera, and they do tend to be, in my opinion, less biased than you would find here in North America. And that did surprise me.
Well, when they were born, they were headhunting for a lot of newscasters and reporters of journalists, I'm going to call them, with good reputations. And I cannot remember who they were, but some of them made the move, much to the surprise and horror of, like, it was like post 9/11, and it's like, okay, you've gone over to the other side. What's the matter with you? But in itself, it'd be kind of interesting to go back and say, particularly in their early days, before it became apparent that no, they do authentically want to report the news. Again, I don't know on a local level what it's like, but internationally, the leanings seem to be more balanced. I would like to look at the reporting histories of those journalists that made the move, because I suspect you're going to find they're well educated in their line of work, and they embrace a rigid morality and ethics in the way that they lead their professional lives. That I think that they're not going to take a job like that blindly. They will do their own investigation, and their conclusion was, you know what, might be worth the risk. This seems to be the type of journalism I've always wanted to do, and it's getting so difficult to compete in the North American market that it became appealing. So I don't think it would have been strictly money. Like, they may have been paid a lot more. I would imagine that, one, they had the coffers to do it, and they may have needed to do it. But I never got the impression that they sold out. Which, you'd think their style of journalism would change because of where they're working. But yeah, that was a big surprise.
Well,
and it could change too, I suppose. But
sure, it could change with any news media. I haven't spent a great deal of time reviewing Aljazeera, just from time to time. And when I do that, I've been generally happy with what I have read. So I think that's something, that's a lesson that probably a lot of North American news media outlets could learn from.
I found their website. I don't go visit it very often, but it comes up in my newsfeed periodically. The only thing is, they just they more often than not are just, this happened, and they report it, as opposed to any leanings one way or another. Right. But they do have editorial type things, which is, when you look at a media's editorial section where they're going to editorialize on a topic, you're certainly going to get a sense after reading a few of them whether that they have a political leanings one way or another.
Right. I do like certain editorialists. More often than not, it's not necessarily their political leaning, it's just how eloquent they can be with the written word, mostly, or the written or the spoken word, but just can they actually express themselves in terms of an argument as opposed to just trying to arouse a particularly hostile emotion in somebody.
Yes.
Now, I'm thinking in particular, one person here in Canada that does it so well is Rex Murphy.
Yes, he does. Yeah, well spoken. A vocabulary that loses a lot of his listeners. but I
keep a dictionary handy.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
He can be witty without necessarily trying to hurt somebody in an ad hominem way.
Yeah, he reminds me of when I run my articles through an app like Grammarly.
Yes.
That comes up my weekly report from Grammarly says you used a unique vocabulary 98% of the time more often than everyone else. Then in the actual analysis, it'll say some of your readers may not understand this word, because you could do your preset, say as to what your audience is going to be. And in my outlook has always been, well, screw them, look it up. If you're not sure, look it up. It's not that hard, eh? You just double click on the word and it pops up and it says, look it up. And then you get a definition and now you're a little smarter than you were before. So I like that Rex Murphy does not dumb down his things for the audience. Yeah. He smarts them up.
John, it's even easier from my end. I have a Google Home Mini. I can just literally say, hey, Google, what's the definition of, give it the word and it'll tell me. So looking things up is extremely easy. Another columnist that I like, and he definitely has a right-wing bias, that's for sure, but he's eloquent and he tries to back up his arguments with facts, reasoning, and logic, and that's actually Conrad Black.
Oh, yes? Yeah.
And you can catch his articles in the National Post from time to time, and they're always interesting, eloquent, and engaging.
Yes. Good writing is part of the equation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. He doesn't make any bones about his particular leanings anyway. You can read it from your own particular political perspective and get something out of it.
That would be a good topic, actually, for standalone, is the dangers of, how is it that we have journalism that is influenced by an outlook that I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, as opposed to looking at an issue and deciding what is the best for the nation, the individual, over the short term, over the long term. When you start to make your decisions and say, well, that's a Republican policy, well, okay, but when your policy is to make decisions based on a philosophy as opposed to the facts at hand, that's so dangerous. That would be, I think that's a topic worthy of depth discussion.
Yeah, the stakes, I think, when it comes to trying to influence people in the media, the stakes at the national political level are so huge that everybody tends to run to their particular party and support them regardless of whether or not the policy is actually good for the entire country.
Like the fact that you have to toe the party line all the time to keep in power is not good for a nation. It's not good for the citizens at all. So we're way off topic here. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I was just going to say, do you think anything would actually get passed at the national level here in Canada for the Parliament? Or in the United States, they've got the three areas of government: the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the Office of the President. So I think to get all three of those to agree at any one particular time would be amazing. And if you broke it down even further, where there were actually free votes, I don't think anything would get passed.
I don't know how you'd structure it. Like if you were allowed, like if it happened in steps where you were free to go on at length, making your argument for or against a particular piece of legislation, where you were towing the party line religiously. So you do all the show, but the vote itself, you could vote your conscience without it being known how you voted. That would change the direction of the planet.
If the elected representatives were allowed to vote anonymously,
yeah,
there might be some difference, yes.
Well, I think that, you're going to have political leanings, philosophical leanings, right or left, for a variety of reasons. But I just think that so much that's gone on south of the border, and even here in Canada, where the decisions were made because, you're just flat out told, if you don't vote the party line, you're out.
Mm-hmm.
That's not right. You're there to represent people who voted for you in your region. That's how you vote, not the party line. That's totally backwards. But that's the system we have, and it's the norm. It's considered, that's the way it is. But maybe these things need to change so that people are allowed to vote their conscience. I mean, what's the point of running for politics if somebody's going to tell you what to say?
Fair enough. With regards to the news media, I think that in a politically correct society such as we have, I'm not really sure if there's any way to sort of correct these imbalances that I see in the press in terms of reporting from an editorial standpoint as opposed to reporting from a strictly factual standpoint. Do you have any hopes for that?
Without educating the audience,
mm-hmm.
learning to think critically, what's a logical fallacy? What's a cognitive bias? You can teach this. You can start it at kindergarten. Let's read this. And now look at it from a critical thinking. Are there any cognitive biases that might influence the conclusion? Are there any logical fallacies in that statement that we should investigate a little bit? If you train a person's brain or their mind to take information in with the filter of critical thinking, then yes, that would change the way the reporters behave, the politicians behave, because the audience is more discriminating. It's like I was saying earlier. Do people have that spidey sense, that thing that goes off and say, is somebody reporting a balanced viewpoint here, or do they have an agenda? I think the agenda form of reporting would become more aware, and that might open the door, because if people are looking for authentic reporting, that would open the door, and we'd have more authentic reporters, because that's what the people want. What people I can't say that they don't want that. Now, they don't know what they want because that's all they got, and they don't know that they're being fed pablum and told it's steak.
I don't know that it's really been any different. I think there's always been these biases within the news media. I think that it's just that there are so many outlets now where people can get their news that it's becoming more obvious, at least to us. I'm not sure long-term if there's anything that can be done to, I don't like to use the word correct it, because that would be prejudiced from my perspective, to move the news media to a more, what their original goals were, to be balanced and fair. I don't know if that can be done at this stage, because the political correct leanings in society are now pretty much endemic to our society. I don't want to be overly pessimistic or
That's because the answer there becomes legislative. It's punitive. Okay, you have to report this way. And it's not that that might not shift things into a better direction, but there are inherent flaws in that approach. The long-term, and use the term long-term, solution would be, to me, is make the audience think more critically. Now, you said something there, whether it's ever been like that. I don't know. When we say that, how far back in history are we going? I mean, how was the news reported in societies that were more critically thinking? Like perhaps, back in Socrates' time, and were people on average thinking more critically then? Did that influence the way? We don't really have the data, but I suspect that if the audience was more sophisticated in the way that they thought, where they thought with the filters of critical thinking, it would have to change the way people gave them information. Because why would I listen to you? As soon as you start, wait a second, there's a logical fallacy in there, and you're influenced by cognitive biases here. Give me a more biased or unbiased report, and I'll listen to you. And then you take them off your potential list as a source, and what you'd end up winning down. So I think that's what I do. I think that's what you do now, but there are not enough people doing it because they don't use those filters, because it's not because they're not capable, but we just don't get exposed to it. And when we don't get exposed to it, we mentioned this at one point, this is the only species on the planet that I'm aware of that we can be influenced by our evolutionary programs and our hormones solely. But when we become aware that our behavior is being impacted by those predispositions, we can do something about it. And it's perfectly normal to be influenced by cognitive biases. It absolutely is. It is. You're never going to get away from them. It's that powerful and inherent in the way that we're hardwired. But when you do increase your awareness and you can do something about it, you can change the way that you interact with your environment. Otherwise, you're just reacting to it.
Right. I think in terms of filtering the information we receive through the news media, that again, there's going to be people with a high level of awareness of this sort of thing. And there are going to be people, they're too caught up in, I guess, basically survival, earning a living, that they'll never reach that stage.
Just have to start off young. You just make it the way that you learn to think. You can leave it to chance, or you can direct it. And so you could, let's use as an example, give it, and this is legitimate. You can raise a child to be prejudiced, racist. Mm-hmm. You can raise a child to not be. You can raise a child to think critically, or leave it to chance and see what happens. Well, the child that you would raise as a racist is less likely to accept your lessons if they're also being taught to think critically. You see my point?
Oh, I do, of course.
That's where you start, is you teach them how to think, and then they're going to be less influenced by what they call now in social media influencers. No credentials whatsoever, but they know how to market, and they're influencers, and people listen to them. Not if they think critically, they won't.
I'm sure that in journalism school, the students are taught these ethics about being balanced and fair. But it just seems that when you get out into the real world, for one reason or another, those particular values are not actually applied in the reporting. Mm-hmm. For some of the reasons that we've talked about.
Yes. Well, sometimes it's just they don't have the strength of character. Sometimes when the difference between making an ethical decision and putting groceries on your family's table come, then people, they pick groceries all too often. And I understand that. I understand that. But we need to provide them with avenues so they don't have to be in that position. Like venues, like proper jobs where here is our mandate. This is how we report the news.
Well, you'll never find a journalist who writes an article that, I mean, the editorials are all reviewed, all of the actual factual reporting that you get during the regular news period, it's all vetted. And yet still these biases creep through. So,
well, I think that they are because they're not creeping. They're permitted. They're sought. They want them. Yeah. In fact, if it doesn't exist, they send it back and say, put one in. We want your readers to come out thinking this.
Do you think it goes that deep, like at the editorial level?
Well, it depends on the media source, but that's an absolute. I mean, there's lots of reports of journalists that have said that they're at the mercy of their editors.
Right. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be spoken explicitly. It's just understood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you report in a certain way, you're the teacher's pet. You get more of your stuff published. If you don't, then you're not only not going to get your stuff published, you're eventually looking for another job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a bit of a difficulty there for somebody who does have an ethical value system.
Yep, it's down to the groceries equation when in situations like that. People, become a journalist because they're passionate. They're often very idealistic, and they want to make a difference and stuff, and they get into the real world and they kick the crap out of them.
Yeah, I think that with the dissemination of information, such as what we're doing right now, I have some hope for the future of journalism, but I'm still frustrated by the preponderance of biases that I see in the mainstream media.
The problem with that, to me, is the algorithms that will lead someone who end up finding this podcast they attract a certain type of person and thinker who doesn't need to hear this. They already think along these terms. If they happen upon us and then they go, these guys are idiots, then they never go back. They'll seek something that confirms a bias, the cognitive bias, their own line of thinking. That's why I keep going back. It has to be education. You have to get to people before they start to form these little mindsets that the algorithms are taking advantage of. We have to create a thought process where, like, it's if I got a news feed where the story comes up, holy crap, this guy, okay, block that news source. Block that news source. I mean, if you had more people thinking critically, eventually you'd end up with only the authentic news reporters.
Well, what do you think the odds are of an educational system adopting those kind of ideas? I mean, I don't see it. I see the educational system tends to be very politically correct and left-leaning, and those values permeate all the way through journalism school right up to the point that you start reporting.
Yep, it will take a revolution. And I don't necessarily mean like an armed revolution where a nation's in total upheaval, but certainly industry-specific revolutions. And I don't know how those fires get lit. I suspect, with regards to this, it's going to be more grassroots. I think that people are becoming more suspect of education, particularly post-secondary education. It's a little bit different in the US, but in Canada, from a university perspective, and the United States university, but colleges, the term college seems to mean something different in the US here. I think it's interchangeable with the word university, but I could be wrong. But I find that most of the colleges up to this point in Canada tend to be very practical in the education that they provide their students. They kind of want them to be able to take that, use that. But in the university system, there's more of a lot more latitude on teaching how to think, but not how to think balanced, how to think critically, but how to think according to the university's agenda. So there was some kind of policy that once, I can't remember, once a year, well, what they tried to do is tell that no white person could come on campus one day a year as representative. And this gentleman, this professor, was a Jewish gentleman, and his perspective of, well, wait a second, I get the message you're trying to do, but this is the exact type of sort of fascist approach that the Jewish community suffered from, where you're dictated, it's mandated. It's a little more complex than that. It's worth looking into. It was bizarre. Anyway, they attacked him physically and his family, and it was just horrible. And
are you saying they physically attacked him?
Yeah, they were chasing him around the campus. So it was just a horror show because of a university that had been driven by basically the students. The students decided what they wanted to be educated and how they wanted to be educated, and it was just unbalanced. I think there's more of that going on, and if there becomes a grassroots resistance. I sent a link to you the other day about, I think Google, they're developing an educational system for skills that they value that will be much more to the point and more affordable for people so that they can get gainful employment and make a decent wage.
And gainful employment in a few months, not the dragged out education that you get at the university level, because the universities basically become a business and an income generator.
Yeah, and in fairness, I think that the topics that they're teaching are so, they're so ever-changing rapidly anyway, that it makes no sense. Like, you could start teaching somebody in a 4-year programming course, and by the time they hit the 4th year, the stuff they learned in the first year is no longer applicable in the first place. It's better to get them involved at where we are now, concentrate it, and get them, to educate them, as I said, to think critically, adapt. You gotta have to adapt all the time. That would be more useful education. But so that's a very centric, Jordan Peterson alluded to this about starting a third-party educational system. And that, I've seen that, like, you do get opportunities where that's where it's a legitimate way to go in order to get some employment. We're not there yet, but I think that's the direction we're going to end up going. You got to wonder with the pandemic here as well, that impact on the universities in itself may force the issue. It's certainly going to offer opportunities for legitimacy to virtual learning. And if the organizations that are creating the virtual learning vehicles embrace this critical thinking model, that'd be fantastic. I mean, I don't want kids to not be able to go to school, but quite frankly, if that means getting them out of the system of where they're not being taught the practical skills that they need to be taught and that are not politically driven, then I'm kind of all for it if it starts to open up the way that I think they might benefit in education. Is it going to be possible that I could start a school program where I offer a specific line of study myself? Like, okay, what I'm going to do is offer kindergarten level critical thinking, grade 1 critical thinking, and that's the aspect where I could get that, put together such a good program in that and some of the other disciplines that we've talked about that are missing in our educational system that could be included and recognized as a legitimate education. If that means pulling kids out of school so that they can only have that one flavor, that would be an upside. I mean, there's some horrible things happening. There's some good things that could come from this, where we're starting to realize, okay, there are ways that we can keep our kids home. Homeschooling was often a little bit thought of as being a little eccentric, and certainly there were often it was for political and religious reasons. But if we got rid of those things, there's a lot to be said if we could structure it in a way that the kids could still benefit from the social interaction with other kids, et cetera.
Right. I think that if that type of education was brought into the school system, it would no doubt filter its way up into journalism and into the news media, which would be a good thing. But you won't be able to dictate what happens at the elementary or high school level. That's all government regulated. The only way that you could do it, I mean, the best case scenario would be to, have your own private college where you're teaching that.
That's what I mean. And so it would have to be grassroots, where it would have to meet guidelines for whatever qualifies as a graduation certificate for elementary school and then high school. But if you got enough people that embrace that model, so I think it would take a significant part of our kids and turn them into far more effective leaders than they would be without. And if you started to see that influence, then I think that it's like people dismissing things because they're new, but then embracing them once they start to see the value, because it takes some time to see how these seeds blossom. It might be 15 years before you start to go, holy crap, of the 1 million kids in this study, 50,000 of them had their education in this, and look what they're doing and how it's affected the quality of their lives and the lives of others. Then we've got some data to go, well, maybe the other 90,000 need to change their programs because they can't compete.
Do you take any specific time of the day to listen to the news or to read or watch the news at all? Well, when do you get your news?
I go through phases. There was a period in my life I just ignored it all. I just didn't do it because there's a certain addictive property to it where you you're looking for your little hit of shock rather than news. But typically what I'll do in the morning is I have like a news feed that I skim. It's very rare that I'll hit on something that I will open up and read it. So I have like a sense of what's going on in the world, but not a passion to investigate it thoroughly. Like I'm not going to take up much of my day on that. One, I think it's unhealthy. We're all going to be influenced by all this negativity. It's like I often thought in the policing world, I mean, that's in the news a lot. I mean, you're setting those men and women up to fail anyway, because you can't be interacting in a career, an entire career. It's just a matter of years where you're dealing with a small fraction of society, let's say 2 or 3%, but 97% of your day, and not come out without a distorted outlook. And then it impacts the way that you interact with your wife and your children and everybody else on the planet. And then you start making dumb decisions on the street because you got twisted up without you even realize. It's insidious in the way that it sneaks up. News does the same thing. Watch enough news because it's not news, it's agenda driven. And it tends to be algorithm driven even further. And the next thing you know, Rush Limbaugh's a reporter to you. And so you're only looking at, and it impacts the way that you interact with your children and your spouse and your workmates. So I'm very careful. It's not something that I want to inject into my body that often. Not in its current state. I pick what if I'm going to actually click, it's going to be like one of the sources you mentioned.
Right. Whenever I talk to you, you seem to know what's going on in the world. You don't seem to be caught off guard by anything. I do listen to the news, usually on the radio in the morning, and I'll try to watch the evening news on television, and I'll check out The Economist online and BBC probably once a day. Sometimes when there's a long article in The Economist, that can take a couple of hours to go through it. So I'm a little bit more into the news than you are, but I'm always conscious of whether or not what they're saying has any particular bend to it. That way, I have a good understanding of not just what's going on here in Canada and in the United States, but throughout the world. I like to know what's going on so that basically I can be mentally prepared. Mm-hmm. Well, that's been very interesting, John. I don't know that we've actually solved the world's journalism problems, but it's been a good talk.
As it was for me.
Okay, we will do another talk then next week, right?
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Check out their YouTube channel or go to www.twooldguystalking.com. See you next time.